At 07:15 hours on January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochrane stood behind his 5-inch gun battery aboard USS Helena, watching 4 Japanese dive bombers streak toward the American task force off Guadalcanal. His gunners had 60 seconds, maybe less, before the Vals released their bombs. Standard procedure was to fire timed shells, set the fuses for altitude, and hope one exploded close enough to damage the aircraft. But the shells loaded in Cochrane's guns that morning weren't standard. They contained something the Japanese had never seen, something so secret that Cochrane's own crew had only learned about it 3 weeks earlier, something that would change naval warfare forever. The shells in his battery carried Mark 32 proximity fuses, radio devices that could detect an aircraft and detonate automatically when close enough to kill, if they worked. Nobody on Helena knew for certain. The tests in Chesapeake Bay had worked perfectly, but combat was different. Combat had variables the tests couldn't predict. Combat would prove whether the billion-dollar secret weapon was real or just expensive hope. One Val broke from the formation, diving toward Helena. Cochrane ordered his battery to engage. The 5-inch guns fired, not once, not twice, 3 times. 3 shells with proximity fuses. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Racing toward the Japanese dive bomber at 2,600 feet per second, each shell contained a miniature radio transmitter, broadcasting continuously, listening for reflections, calculating distance. And when the distance reached 70 feet, the radio circuit closed and detonated the shell. The first explosion tore through the Val's left wing. The second shredded the fuselage. The third was unnecessary. The aircraft was already burning, spiraling into the sea. Cochrane's battery had fired 3 shells, 1 Japanese aircraft destroyed. No direct hit required. The gunners stared at each other. They'd just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. Anti-aircraft gunnery in 1943 required hundreds of shells to bring down a single aircraft. Helena had done it with 3. The problem with shooting aircraft had existed since the First World War. Airplanes moved fast. They maneuvered unpredictably. They operated in 3 dimensions. A 5-inch anti-aircraft shell fired from a ship traveled nearly 3 miles in 10 seconds, but the aircraft wasn't stationary. It was banking, climbing, diving. By the time the shell reached the calculated intercept point, the aircraft had moved. Maybe 50 feet, maybe 200, and a shell that missed by 50 feet was useless. It exploded harmlessly in empty sky while the aircraft continued its attack. The standard solution was volume of fire. If one shell had a low probability of hitting, fire 100 shells, fire 1,000. Saturate the sky with explosions, and eventually one might damage the target. But that approach had problems. Ships carried limited ammunition. 5-inch shells weighed 54 pounds each. Storage space was finite. A destroyer might carry 600 rounds total. A cruiser like Helena carried more, but even cruisers ran out of ammunition in extended engagements. More critically, timed fuses were unreliable. The fuse mechanism had to be set before firing, based on the estimated range and altitude of the target. If the estimate was wrong by even half a second, the shell exploded too early or too late. Fire control computers helped with calculations, but they couldn't predict what the aircraft would do after the shell was fired. Evasive maneuvers, speed changes, altitude changes, all of those variables made timed fuses ineffective. The statistics from early Pacific battles proved it. In 1942, American ships fired an average of 2,600 shells for every enemy aircraft destroyed. That number was catastrophic. It meant American ships were running out of ammunition faster than they could resupply. It meant Japanese aircraft were getting through the defensive fire and hitting their targets. It meant American sailors were dying because their weapons couldn't protect them. The British had recognized this problem in 1939. They'd been working on proximity detection methods since before the war started. Photoelectric fuses that detected changes in light, acoustic fuses that responded to engine noise, magnetic fuses that sensed metal. None of them worked reliably. Photoelectric fuses couldn't distinguish between clouds and aircraft. Acoustic fuses were overwhelmed by the noise of the shell's own flight. Magnetic fuses had insufficient range. In 1940, British scientists shared their research with American counterparts through the TESAD mission. Among the technologies transferred was the cavity magnetron, a device that could generate high-frequency radio waves. The magnetron made modern radar possible, but it also made something else possible. A radio proximity fuse small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The National Defense Research Committee assigned the problem to Section T at the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Merle Tuve led the research team. The requirements were brutal. Create a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside a 5-inch shell, make it rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun. The acceleration, when a 5-inch gun fired, exceeded 20,000 times the force of gravity. Electronic components that survived that acceleration didn't exist. Make it reliable enough to work under combat conditions, salt water, extreme temperatures, electromagnetic interference from radar and radio transmissions. Make it cheap enough to mass produce. Millions of shells would be needed. Each shell was expendable. Make it simple enough that ordinary sailors could handle it without specialized training. And make it so secret that if a shell failed to detonate and fell into enemy hands, the technology couldn't be reverse engineered. Tuve's team started with vacuum tubes. In 1940, vacuum tubes were fragile glass devices used in radios. They shattered if you dropped them. They failed if they got too hot or too cold. And they were definitely not designed to survive 20,000 Gs. But vacuum tubes were the only technology available that could amplify radio signals. Solid-state electronics didn't exist yet. Tuve's engineers had to make vacuum tubes survive conditions they were never designed for. They started by making them smaller. Standard radio tubes were 3 inches tall. The proximity fuse tubes had to be 3/4 of an inch. Sylvania Electric developed the manufacturing process. They created tubes with thicker glass, shorter filaments, stronger internal supports. The tubes still broke during early tests. Shells were fired at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Engineers recovered the shells and examined the tubes inside. Shattered glass, broken filaments, failed connections. They redesigned the tubes, thicker glass, stronger supports, different internal geometry. They tested again. More failures. They redesigned again. By early 1942, they had tubes that survived firing 70% of the time. Not perfect, but functional. The radio circuit was next. The proximity fuse used a simple but elegant design. The transmitter generated a continuous radio wave at around 180 MHz. The shell's body acted as the antenna. As the shell flew through the air, it broadcast continuously. When the radio wave hit a reflective object like an aircraft, some of the energy bounced back. The receiver detected the reflected signal. As the shell approached the aircraft, the reflected signal got stronger. When the strength reached a predetermined threshold, the circuit closed and fired the detonator. The entire system had to operate on battery power. The battery had to be small, light, and powerful enough to run the circuit for the shell's flight time. Shells fired at high altitude might fly for 30 seconds before reaching the target. The battery had to last that long, and it had to activate automatically when the shell was fired. A mechanical switch closed when the gun's acceleration crushed a small ampule, allowing battery acid to flow and activate the power supply. The detonator was equally critical. It had to be safe during handling and storage. It had to arm itself after the shell left the gun barrel. And it had to fire reliably when the radio circuit signaled. Safety mechanisms prevented premature detonation. The fuse wouldn't arm until the shell had traveled at least 300 yards from the gun. That gave the firing ship time to clear the danger zone. After 300 yards, a mechanical timer armed the detonator. From that point forward, the proximity fuse was live. If the radio circuit detected a target, it would detonate. By August 1942, the E Mark 32 proximity fuse was ready for testing. The Navy scheduled trials aboard USS Cleveland, a new light cruiser on its shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay. The test plan called for 2 days of firing at radio-controlled drone aircraft. Cleveland's 5-inch batteries would fire proximity-fused shells at the drones, while the drones maneuvered evasively. On August 12th, Cleveland began firing. The first salvo destroyed the first drone. The second salvo destroyed the second drone. The third salvo destroyed the third drone. 4 shells fired, 3 drones destroyed. The test director cancelled the remaining trials. The proximity fuse worked better than anyone had predicted. Production began immediately. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati received the first manufacturing contract, 500 fuses per day initially. Crosley had experience with precision manufacturing and electronics assembly. They'd built radio components before the war. But proximity fuses were different. Each fuse contained approximately 130 individual parts: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, battery cells, detonators. Every part had to meet strict specifications. Every part had to be tested. Quality control was absolute. A single defective component could cause the fuse to fail, and failure in combat meant American sailors died. Other manufacturers joined the program. RCA, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, Sylvania. By late 1943, production had ramped up to 40,000 fuses per day. The entire program employed over 100 factories. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured by the end of the war. The cost exceeded $1 billion in 1940s money. But secrecy was paramount. The proximity fuse was classified at the highest level. Sailors who handled the shells were told only that these were special ammunition. They weren't told how the fuses worked. They weren't told about the radio transmitters inside. The official designation was VT fuse, variable time. The name was deliberately misleading. It suggested the fuses were just improved timed fuses, nothing revolutionary, nothing the enemy would desperately want to capture and study. The Navy issued strict rules. Proximity fused shells could only be used over water, never over land where a dud might be recovered, never in situations where the enemy could examine an intact fuse. The risk of compromise was too high. In October 1942, the first combat-ready proximity fuses were shipped to the Pacific. Commander William Parsons personally escorted the shipment from California to Noumea in New Caledonia. Parsons was a brilliant ordnance officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay. He understood the importance of the proximity fuse. He understood that this weapon could change the balance of power in the Pacific. At Noumea, the fuses were distributed to 3 ships: USS Enterprise, the carrier that had survived multiple battles; USS Saratoga, another carrier that had been torpedoed and repaired; and USS Helena, a light cruiser that had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Helena had survived the Pearl Harbor attack despite being torpedoed. She'd spent months in repair. By late 1942, she was back in combat in the Solomon Islands. Her crew knew what Japanese air attacks looked like. They'd experienced them repeatedly. On December 5, 1942, Helena received 500 proximity-fused shells. Lieutenant Commander Cochrane supervised the loading. His gun crews were briefed on handling procedures. Don't drop the shells. Don't expose them to excessive heat. Don't attempt to disassemble or examine them. Load them like standard ammunition. Fire them like standard ammunition. The fuse will do the rest. The briefing didn't explain how the fuses worked. That information was classified. The gun crews just knew these shells were different, special, and they were ordered to use them against every air target. For weeks, nothing happened. The Japanese launched air raids, but Helena wasn't in position to engage. The special shells sat in the magazine, waiting. On January 5, 1943, Helena was operating with a small task force south of Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal campaign was in its final stages. American forces controlled Henderson Field. Japanese forces were evacuating, but Japanese aircraft still operated from Rabaul, striking at American ships whenever opportunity allowed. That morning, 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers found Helena's task force. The Vals were obsolete by 1943 standards, slow, poorly armed, but they were accurate. Japanese dive bomber pilots trained extensively. They could place a bomb within yards of their target, and a single bomb hit could cripple or sink a cruiser. The Vals approached from the north, staying low to avoid early radar detection. By the time Helena's lookout spotted them, the Japanese aircraft were already beginning their attack runs. One Val targeted HMNZS Achilles, a New Zealand light cruiser operating with the American force. The bomb hit. Achilles was damaged but remained afloat. The other 3 Vals broke off after their attack, turning to escape at low altitude. This was standard Japanese doctrine. Attack fast, get in close, release bombs, escape before the defensive fire got organized. Most of the time it worked. In this, American ships fired hundreds of shells at departing Japanese aircraft and rarely scored hits, but Cochrane's battery on Helena was ready. The 5-inch guns tracked the departing Vals. Range approximately 4,000 yards, altitude approximately 1,500 feet, speed approximately 200 miles per hour. In a traditional engagement, Cochrane's fire control officer would have set the shell fuses for altitude and fired a barrage, maybe 10 shells, maybe 20. Hope that one exploded close enough to damage the target, but the shells loaded in Helena's guns didn't need altitude settings. The proximity fuses would handle that automatically. Cochrane's fire control officer calculated the firing solution: lead angle, elevation. The guns trained onto the target. At 0716, Cochrane gave the order: fire. The first shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. The acceleration crushed the activation ampule. Battery acid flowed. The radio transmitter powered up. 200 yards from the ship, the safety timer armed the detonator. The shell was live. The transmitter broadcast its signal, 180 megahertz, continuous wave, searching for reflections. The Val was ahead, climbing slightly, turning to the west. The shell's trajectory intersected the aircraft's path. Range decreased 2,000 yards, 1,500. The reflected radio signal grew stronger. The receiver detected the increase. The circuit monitored the signal strength. At 70 feet from the Val, the threshold was reached. The circuit closed. The detonator fired. High explosives detonated. The shell casing fragmented into thousands of pieces. Shrapnel sprayed outward in a lethal sphere. Fragments tore through the Val's left wing. The fuel tank ruptured. Fire erupted. The pilot tried to maintain control, but the wing structure had failed. The Val rolled left and entered a spin. It hit the water. 10 seconds later, Cochrane's guns fired 2 more shells at the same target, but they weren't needed. The Val was already falling. The other Vals escaped. They were too far away by the time Helena's guns engaged. But 1 kill from 3 shells was revolutionary. The gun crews knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Word spread through the ship. The special shells worked. They really worked. No direct hit required. Just get close, and the shell detonated automatically. Cochrane filed his action report that evening. He noted the proximity fuse had performed as designed. 1 aircraft destroyed with minimal ammunition expenditure. He recommended continued use for all air targets. Commander William Parsons received the report in Noumea. He forwarded it to Washington with his own assessment. The proximity fuse had achieved its first combat kill. The weapon was proven. Production should be increased. More ships should receive the ammunition as quickly as possible. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Force, read the report with satisfaction. Halsey understood air defense. His carriers had been under constant Japanese air attack since the Guadalcanal campaign began. Every aircraft shot down meant one fewer bomb aimed at his ships. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And if proximity fuses could shoot down aircraft more efficiently, that meant his ships would survive longer. He ordered maximum distribution of proximity-fused ammunition to all ships under his command. By February 1943, most of Halsey's cruisers and destroyers had received proximity-fused shells. The effectiveness became apparent immediately. In 1942, American ships in the Pacific had fired an average of 2,600 shells per aircraft destroyed. In early 1943, with only 25% of shells using proximity fuses, the average dropped to 1,200 shells per aircraft. By mid-1943, with 75% of shells using proximity fuses, the average dropped to 600 shells per aircraft. The ratio improved by a factor of 4, and combat reports showed the proximity-fused shells were responsible for over half of all aircraft destroyed, despite representing only a quarter of the ammunition fired initially. The lethality difference was stark. A timed fuse shell had to explode within approximately 10 feet of an aircraft to guarantee a kill. The fragment pattern from a 5-inch shell spread roughly 60 feet in diameter at 10 feet from the detonation point. But at 50 feet, the fragments were spread so thin that most passed harmlessly around the aircraft. A proximity-fused shell could detonate at 70 feet and still achieve a kill. The fragment pattern at 70 feet was larger, but the sheer number of fragments compensated. The effective lethal area was 3,000 square feet for a proximity fuse versus 60 square feet for a timed fuse, 50 times more lethal. The Japanese noticed the change immediately. Their pilots reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become more accurate. Shells were exploding closer to aircraft. More aircraft were being damaged or destroyed. The Japanese Navy analyzed recovered shell fragments. They found nothing unusual. The fragments looked like standard anti-aircraft shells. They had no way of knowing that the fuses were different. They had no way of knowing that radio transmitters were guiding the detonations. Japanese intelligence speculated that American radar had improved, that American fire control computers were more accurate, that American gunners were better trained. All of those factors were true, but they weren't the primary reason for improved anti-aircraft effectiveness. The proximity fuse was the reason, and the proximity fuse remained secret. The Japanese never captured an intact Mark 32 fuse during the war. Every proximity-fused shell either detonated as designed or fell into the ocean where it couldn't be recovered. The security protocols worked. The weapon remained secret until after the war ended. By late 1943, proximity fuses were being used in multiple theaters, against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, against German V-1 rockets over England. In December 1944, proximity fuses were finally authorized for use over land. During the Battle of the Bulge, General George Patton had requested permission to use proximity-fused artillery shells against German ground forces. The Pentagon had refused for months due to security concerns. But the Battle of the Bulge was desperate. German forces had broken through American lines. The weather was terrible. Air support was impossible. Artillery was the only weapon available. Eisenhower authorized use of proximity fuses. 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells were shipped to the front. The shells were devastating. Traditional artillery shells buried themselves in the ground before exploding. The explosion was directed downward. Soldiers in trenches or foxholes were protected by the earth. Proximity-fused shells detonated 20 feet above the ground. The explosion was directed downward in a cone. Fragments hit soldiers who were dug in. There was no protection except overhead cover, and most German positions didn't have overhead cover. Patton wrote to the War Department after the battle. He said the proximity fuse was devastating. He said it had changed the nature of warfare. He said that when all armies had this weapon, new tactics would be required. The Germans were terrified. They'd never seen artillery that exploded in the air without a visible reason. They thought it was some new form of American magic, some new technology they couldn't understand. They were right. It was new technology, and they couldn't understand it because they'd never developed it themselves. German scientists had researched proximity fuses. They'd developed over 30 different designs: acoustic fuses, magnetic fuses, electrostatic fuses, radio fuses. None of them had worked reliably enough for combat use. The Germans had the same problem the British and Americans had faced: making the components small enough and rugged enough. German industry couldn't solve the miniaturization problem. Their vacuum tubes were too large, their batteries were too heavy, their circuits were too complex. By the time German engineers had developed a working prototype in late 1944, it was too late. Germany was losing the war, production facilities were being bombed, resources were scarce. The proximity fuse never entered German service. The Japanese faced the same problem. They'd captured American shells on various Pacific islands. They'd examined the fragments. They'd found nothing unusual. They'd never suspected that the fuses contained radio transmitters because the idea seemed impossible. How could you fit a radio inside a shell? How could the radio survive being fired from a gun? The Japanese didn't have cavity magnetrons. They didn't have miniaturized vacuum tubes. They didn't have the industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronics. By the time they understood what Americans had done, the war was over. The proximity fuse's contribution to Allied victory was immense. In the Pacific, it protected American carriers from Japanese air attack. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carriers shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft. The engagement was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Proximity-fused shells were responsible for a significant portion of those kills. Against V-1 rockets over England, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells achieved a 79% kill rate. Without proximity fuses, the V-1 attacks would have caused far more damage to London. At the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused artillery shells inflicted casualties on German forces that would have been impossible with conventional ammunition. The strategic impact was clear. The proximity fuse allowed Allied forces to defend against air attack more effectively. It allowed Allied forces to use artillery more effectively. It saved thousands of Allied lives by preventing enemy aircraft from reaching their targets and by killing enemy soldiers more efficiently. But the human cost of that effectiveness was rarely discussed. Each proximity-fused shell that detonated near a Japanese aircraft killed the pilot and crew, young men, trained extensively, flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. Each proximity-fused artillery shell that detonated over German positions killed soldiers who were already retreating, already defeated. The weapon was effective. That was the point. War demands effective weapons, but effectiveness has a cost. The proximity fuse made killing more efficient, more precise, more certain. That was both its achievement and its burden. USS Helena, the ship that scored the first proximity fuse kill, didn't survive the war. On July 6, 1943, Helena was operating in Kula Gulf during the Solomon Islands campaign. 3 Japanese destroyers attacked at night. Torpedoes hit Helena's forward engine room and magazine. The ship broke in two and sank in less than 20 minutes. Over 100 sailors died. The survivors were rescued by other ships in the task force. Lieutenant Commander Cochrane survived. He continued to serve through the war. He never forgot that morning in January when 3 shells had destroyed a Japanese dive bomber. He knew the proximity fuse had worked because of hundreds of engineers and scientists who'd solved impossible problems. He knew it had worked because Sylvania had perfected miniature vacuum tubes, because Crosley had built fuses to exact specifications, because Commander Parsons had delivered the ammunition personally, because Admiral Halsey had trusted the new technology. The proximity fuse wasn't one person's achievement. It was the result of coordinated effort by thousands of individuals, scientists who designed the circuits, engineers who tested the prototypes, factory workers who'd assembled the components, sailors who'd loaded the shells and fired the guns. Each person contributed to the weapon that changed naval warfare. And most of them never received recognition. The proximity fuse remained classified until 1945. After the war ended, the Navy released information about the weapon, but the individual contributions remained obscure. The engineers at Applied Physics Laboratory, the workers at Crosley and Sylvania, the sailors who'd fired the first combat rounds. Their names weren't in the official histories. Their work was acknowledged in general terms, but not attributed specifically. Dr. Merle Tuve, who'd led Section T, received some recognition after the war, but he always insisted that the proximity fuse was a team effort. No single person could claim credit. Thousands of people had made it possible. Commander Parsons went on to arm the atomic bomb. His work on the proximity fuse prepared him for the Manhattan Project. Both weapons required precise coordination between research, production, and deployment. Both weapons required absolute secrecy. Parsons understood how to manage secret weapons programs. The proximity fuse taught him. Admiral Halsey became famous for his aggressive carrier operations, but he understood that air defense mattered as much as air offense. His carriers could strike at Japanese bases because proximity fuses protected them from Japanese counterstrikes. The weapon enabled the strategy. General Patton became famous for his armored breakthroughs, but his success at the Bulge depended on artillery support. Proximity-fused shells gave him that support when air support was impossible. The weapon enabled the victory. In the decades after the war, proximity-fused technology evolved. Radar fuses became more sophisticated. Infrared fuses were developed. Laser fuses appeared in the 1980s. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Detect the target automatically. Detonate at the optimal range. Maximize lethality without requiring a direct hit. The Mark 32 proximity fuse from 1942 was primitive by modern standards. It used vacuum tubes instead of transistors. It used analog circuits instead of digital processors. It broadcast at a single frequency instead of using frequency hopping. But it worked. It solved a problem that had plagued anti-aircraft gunnery since the First World War, and it proved that even in warfare, engineering mattered as much as courage. The sailors who'd fought at Guadalcanal knew courage. They'd faced Japanese aircraft attacks repeatedly. They'd watched their ships burn. They'd pulled wounded shipmates from flooded compartments. Courage was never in question. But courage without effective weapons meant death. The proximity fuse gave American sailors an effective weapon. It meant fewer Japanese aircraft reached their targets. It meant fewer American ships were hit. It meant fewer American sailors died. That was the purpose of the weapon. Not to make killing easier, but to make survival more likely. For the sailors firing the guns. For the ships they protected. For the men depending on those ships to bring them home. The proximity fuse succeeded at that purpose. The statistics proved it. In 1942, before proximity fuses, American ships in the Pacific lost 2.3 ships per month to air attack. In 1943, with proximity fuses, the loss rate dropped to 0.8 ships per month. In 1944 and 45, as proximity fuse distribution increased, the loss rate dropped further. The weapon worked, and the engineers who'd built it never knew most of the pilots they'd killed, never knew most of the sailors they'd saved. They'd solved a technical problem. They'd created a device that detected aircraft and detonated at the right range. Whether that device saved American lives or ended Japanese lives was a consequence of the war, not the engineering. But the distinction mattered, because engineering is neutral. A proximity fuse can protect a hospital from air attack, or it can destroy a civilian aircraft. The technology doesn't care. Humans decide how technology is used, and in war, those decisions carry weight. The American military used proximity fuses to defend ships and troops, to shoot down attacking aircraft, to destroy enemy forces who were actively fighting. The weapon was never used indiscriminately. It was never used against civilian targets. The restrictions on using proximity fuses over land until the Battle of the Bulge proved that the military leadership understood the risks. They understood that a powerful weapon required careful control. That secrecy was necessary not just to protect the technology, but to prevent its misuse. After the war, proximity fuse technology was shared with Allied nations. Britain received the designs. France received them. Eventually, as the Cold War developed, even former enemies received the technology. West Germany integrated proximity fuses into its rebuilt military. Japan, rebuilt under American occupation, eventually developed its own proximity fuses for self-defense. The weapon that had been America's most closely guarded secret became common knowledge. The technology spread because defensive weapons are eventually shared. Offensive weapons might remain secret, but weapons that protect ships and troops from attack serve everyone's interest. Today, every modern military uses proximity fuses. Anti-aircraft missiles carry them. Artillery shells carry them. Even small arms grenades can carry proximity fuses. The technology that required $1 billion investment and thousands of engineers in 1942 is now routine. Standard equipment. Unremarkable. But on that morning of January 5th, 1943, when Lieutenant Commander Cochrane's guns fired 3 shells and destroyed a Japanese dive bomber, it was revolutionary. It was proof that impossible problems can be solved, that engineering and science can change the course of war, that the right weapon in the right hands at the right moment can make all the difference. The Vals that crashed into the sea off Guadalcanal was the first of hundreds of thousands of aircraft destroyed by proximity-fused weapons. The pilot who died in that aircraft never knew what killed him. He didn't see the shell that exploded 70 feet from his wing. He didn't know about the radio transmitter broadcasting inside the shell. He didn't know about Dr. Tuve's research team or Sylvania's vacuum tubes or Crosley's assembly lines. He just knew that American anti-aircraft fire had suddenly become more accurate, more lethal, more devastating. And he was right. American anti-aircraft fire had changed because 300 years of artillery doctrine had been overturned by a 3-inch device containing 4 vacuum tubes and a radio transmitter. Because engineers had solved problems that seemed impossible, because sailors had trusted a weapon they didn't fully understand, because in war, the side that can innovate faster, produce better technology, and deploy it effectively usually wins. The proximity fuse didn't win the war alone. Radar mattered, code breaking mattered, industrial production mattered, courage and leadership and tactics all mattered, but the proximity fuse mattered too. It saved American lives, it destroyed enemy forces, it changed how naval battles were fought, and it proved that sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields. They're won in laboratories, in factories, in the patient, unglamorous work of engineers solving technical problems. Those engineers never became famous. Their names aren't taught in schools, but their work changed history, and that work deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.